7 strangest unsolved mysteries nobody can explain. Some things just don't make any sense. Most people like to believe that everything can be figured out or solved given time. But that's not always the case. Take these 7 mysteries, for example. They have remained unsolved for decades, if not longer, mystifying experts. This is certainly the case for our first supernatural unsolved mystery. It's one of the most bizarre, not to mention terrifying, mysteries of the modern age. The unfathomable deaths of 9 Russian mountaineers, whose cross-country skiing trip ended in a tragedy so horrifying and perplexing that it has mystified experts, and indeed the world ever since. 1. Leroy Carter Jr. On February 7, 1981, Leroy Carter Jr., a 29-year-old African-American, was walking through Golden Gate Park in San Francisco searching for a place to sleep. He found a secluded spot next to Alvord Lake, where he slipped into his sleeping bag and went to sleep. The papers didn't say much about the murder. Those papers that did run the story relegated it to a small blurb hidden somewhere near the back. To many, it was just the story of a dead homeless man, and it was only the manner of his death that made it notable. Carter had been found decapitated, and evidence found at the scene pointed towards voodoo. Alvord Lake sits at the eastern edge of Golden Gate Park, across from the iconic Haight-Ashbury district. The epicenter of the hippie movement of the 1960s, the Haight was filled with lost children living on the streets, and searching for meaning and purpose. Some found that purpose, but as the 70s rolled on, drugs, especially heroin, devastated the district. Free love and peace had been replaced by a growing epidemic of overdoses and crime. However, during the 1980s, the Haight made a comeback as a new generation moved in. There was a growing and proud homosexual community, a budding comedy scene that launched the careers of Whoopi Goldberg and Robin Williams, and white upper-middle-class families, merging with Haight's colorful past. A McDonald's opened at the far west end of the district. Haight-Ashbury was officially gentrified. Just across the street, in the shadow of those golden arches, was Golden Gate Park. A popular spot for tourists, it was also a haven for thugs and junkies searching for victims and a fix. Police warned tourists to avoid the park. Leroy Carter Jr. was an African-American man who survived the Vietnam War only to return home with no direction or guidance. He found comfort on the streets, surviving day-to-day just as he had done in the jungles of Vietnam. Carter was a petty criminal with a vagrant's rap sheet, doing what needed to be done to get by. There was nothing about his life that seemed to be linked to the occult or voodoo. From all outward appearances, it looked as though Leroy Carter Jr. just picked the wrong place to sleep. When the police found Carter's body, he was still in his sleeping bag by the lake. His head was missing, sliced clean through. 2 corn cobs and a chicken wing had been jammed into his severed neck. 50 yards from the body, police found the mutilated remains of several dead chickens. The case was assigned to SFPD Inspector Sandy Gallant. Gallant had recently headed up the department's investigation into the Jonestown massacre in Guyana and its connection to San Francisco. In doing so, she had become the department's expert on cults and religious ritualistic killings. Many of the cults surrounding San Francisco were born out of communal lifestyles of the late 60s and early 70s. Although most of these communes had either dissolved or learned to continue on as a peaceful assembly of like-minded spirits, a small minority had morphed into cults. But Leroy's murder didn't have the markings of your average white bread Manson-esque hippie cult. The dead chicken pointed something not all that common in San Francisco. Inspector Gallant turned to Dade County, Florida Coroner Charles Whiteley, the country's leading expert on Santeria. Santeria was brought to the New World on slave ships. It began with the Yoruba people, an African tribe living in what is now north-central Nigeria. It developed in the Caribbean where it merged with elements of Christianity, before coming to the southern coast of the United States. Sacrifice plays a major role in Santeria but mostly involves the use of live chicken, but there are those underground sects who still seek out human victims. Whiteley informed Inspector Gallant that the ritual was not yet complete. If this was indeed Santeria, the killer would be returning to the scene of the crime 42 days later, to return the body's head. For the next 41 days, investigators sifted through evidence which all led nowhere, but in the back of her mind Gallant knew day 42 was fast approaching. On March 22, 1981, Galland and her partner were back in the park, staking out the spot where Carter's headless body was found. Despite their vigilance, the killer placed the head in the weeds next to Ourang Lake without being detected. The killer had completed the ritual and gotten away yet again. The head gave police no new leads into the murder, and the case went cold. Galland eventually became an outspoken opponent of the popular role-playing game Dungeons & Dragons, even giving lectures warning parents of its connection to occult murder and suicide. Leroy Carter Jr.'s remains were interred at Arlington National Cemetery in Virginia. To this day, Leroy Carter Jr.'s murder remains unsolved. 2. The baffling case of little Pauline Picard. Sometimes strange events sound like they could have been plucked straight out of the plot from a movie, but fact can often be much stranger than fiction. And that's just the case with the incident of Pauline Picard, a young French girl who went missing in 1922 right off her family's farm in Brittany, France. The story got stranger and stranger as events unfolded, and it was in fact her potential recovery that turned the entire investigation and search completely on its head. Pauline Picard was 2 years old in April 1922, when she went missing from her family home in Goes-à-Ladue, France. A thorough search was conducted by local police and volunteers that amounted no results. Many believed she had been kidnapped by a local caravan of gypsies and ferried off without a trace. The situation seemed bleak when, a few weeks later, word came that a young girl matching Pauline's description had been found wandering alone in Cherbourg, over 300 miles away from where Pauline had originally been reported missing. Her mother identified her via photograph, and the police officer who found her was satisfied it was the same girl. The mystery of how a toddler could find herself several hundred miles away from home was brushed aside in the wake of relief of her safe return. The parents traveled to retrieve their daughter, but the blissful reunion was not without its oddities. The girl was very distant with her apparent parents. Even more baffling, she did not respond when spoken to in her native Breton dialect. Her overjoyed parents chalked it up to trauma and returned to Goes-à-Ladue with their now recovered daughter, and all seemed set right. In fact, newspapers across France, and even as far as the New York Times, reported the strange, but the miraculous return of the missing child. However, just weeks after returning home, the Picards began to suspect the girl was not actually their daughter. During this period, another local farmer, Yves Martin, asked the parents point blank if they thought the girl was truly their daughter, before exclaiming, "God help me, I am guilty," and running off. The man was committed to an asylum, and never heard from again. And then a discovery was made that turned the Picards' world upside down once more. A neighboring farmer was walking across the Picard farm when he found something truly disturbing: the body of a very young girl, decapitated, brutally disfigured, and naked with a skull nearby. The man went to the police, who went to investigate the site along with the Picards. The body was damaged and decaying past the point of identification, but Pauline's mother noted the clothes found nearby matched the outfit Pauline had been wearing the day she vanished. Stranger still, the location where the remains had been found had already been searched during the initial canvassing of the area, which led investigators to believe the body had only recently been moved there. Things became even more bizarre when the autopsy on the skull found near the body was found it was too large to have belonged to the young girl they discovered. In fact, the skull didn't even belong to a woman, it was the skull of an unidentified full-grown male. This opened the case even wider. Now there were two victims, with a kidnapper and potential murderer still on the loose somewhere in the area. Ultimately, and tragically, no conclusion could be reached in the case that seemed to have a never-ending list of questions. Was the hysterical man who questioned Pauline's parents her killer? Did he kill the man to whom the skull belonged? Or did the skull belong to Pauline's killer? Who then were the parents of the girl from Cherbourg, and how could the Picards have so grossly misidentified her? Sadly, no answers could be found. In fact, even with the Picards' identification of her clothes, there was still no proof that the body found on their property was actually Pauline's. The young girl from Cherbourg was sent back to be put in an orphanage, and the Picards spent the rest of their days with the mystery of their daughter's fate. It is possible that answers lie in the strange emotions of grief and mourning. After all, Mrs. Picard could have very well simply wished too hard that the Cherbourg girl was her daughter, and found herself willing to ignore the obvious holes in that theory. Our crazed local man, Eve Martin, is still considered the prime suspect by many, though his ultimate fate after entering the asylum was never known. As for the most mysterious part of this, the skull was never identified, and no missing men were postulated as possible identities. This is not the only time in history that mistaken identity, and an apparent amnesia of native language has baffled the public. Anna Anderson, ironically during that same year in 1922, was identified as the missing Grand Duchess Anastasia, despite apparent language barriers, to controversial opinions and an ultimate public refusal of the woman's claims. Today most accept at this point the body located on the property was Pauline's. The identity of the owner of the disembodied head remains a mystery. And as for the strange doppelganger from Cherbourg, she too has been lost to the pages of history. 3. The Dyatlov Pass Mystery. In January of 1959, 23-year-old Igor Dyatlov led a group of 8 young Soviet hikers, comprising 7 men and 2 women, and mostly university students, into the Ural Mountains, attempting to reach Mount Ortorten, from the small settlement of Tsai. It took more than 3 months to locate all 9 of their bodies. They were found about 6 miles away from their destination, in a forest almost a mile away from their campsite, without their skis, shoes, or coats in approximately -30 degrees Fahrenheit weather. 2 of them had fractured skulls, 2 more had major chest fractures, and 1 hiker was missing her tongue. Soviet investigators listed the cause of death as a compelling natural force, and abruptly closed the case not even a month later. Here's what we know about the incident. 6 of the skiers died of hypothermia and 3 died of injuries. They died separately. 2 of them were found under a cedar tree near the remains of a fire, while 3 others were found in intervals of hundreds of feet from the tree, and 4 more were in a ravine another 250 feet away. The 2 under the tree had burned hands. The 4 in the ravine weren't found until May 4th, 3 months after the incident. The dead seem to have donated some of their clothing items to the living. Lyudmila Dubinina's foot was wrapped in a piece of Yuri Krivonisenko's pants, while Simeon Zolotaryev was found wearing Dubinina's hat and coat, and some garments had cuts in them, as though they were forcibly removed. Consistently, there were 8 or 9 sets of footprints in the snow, accounting only for the skiers and not suggesting another party's involvement, on foot, at least. There was no sign of struggle or of any other human or animal approaching the campsite. There was a snowstorm the night of February 2nd, which is when it was determined, via their diaries, that they died. Their campsite was made on the slopes of Galatsiakl, Dead Mountain, at about 3,600 feet. All the travelers, 8 of them in their early/mid-20s with Zolotaryev in his late 30s, were experienced mountaineers, having skied across frozen lakes, and totally uninhabited areas to get there. Despite nasty weather and slower progress than they'd planned, their last diary entries reflected high spirits. Charmingly, in a very typical Soviet way of bonding, they even produced a little newspaper about the trip, which they titled The Evening Orton and which bore the headline, "From now on, we know that the snowmen exist." It goes on to say, they can be met in the northern Urals, next to a tall Orton mountain. They were, it's thought, probably jokingly referring to themselves. After the first 5 bodies were found, a legal inquest began, eventually determining that the cause of death was hypothermia. The deaths seemed kind of straightforward at first. Sure, these dead were in various stages of undress, including one in his underwear, but this was explained away as paradoxical undressing, which happens in about 25% of hypothermia victims, as the hypothalamus malfunctions, and body temperature seems to rise, when it's really dropping. But then it got super weird. The skiers badly damaged and, it was determined, had been cut open from the inside, and all of their stuff was still in it. Why were they dead of exposure if they'd had access to their winter gear, before going out into the freezing winds? To all appearances, they appeared to have left the tent out of their own volition and in a hurry. Bizarrely, Zolotaryev fled the camp with his camera but not his gear. As well, Rustem Slobodin, who, along with Dyatlov and Zina Kolmogova, seemed to have died in a pose indicating he was trying to return to the tent, had a small crack in his skull, but it was ruled that the elements were what killed him, not the fracture. No external wounds were discovered. Things got really shaken up when the 4 bodies in the ravine were found and examined. Both Dubinina and Zolotaryev had fractured ribs, while Nikolai Thibobrigmus had a major skull fracture. One of the investigators compared the force required to injure a human so severely to that of a car crash. The injuries were absolutely not caused by force exerted by another human being. Once again, no soft tissue damage was observed, as though the skiers' bodies were crushed by pressure. When Dubinina was found to be missing her tongue, the theory of another party's possible involvement must have arisen again. Who would do this? Why? Or did another skier from the group cut it out? And where did it go? But there were absolutely no indications of other people having been nearby, apart from the other travelers in Dyatlov's group, not even the native Mansi people sometimes known to inhabit the area. And, perhaps most baffling of all, some of the skiers' clothing was found to contain significant levels of radiation. Due to an absence of a guilty party, the inquest was closed in May of 1959, only a few short weeks after the last 4 bodies were discovered, and the files were archived and classified. When they finally became accessible in the 1990s, post-Soviet era, parts of them were missing. Without any real, public answers to any of these freaky questions, all manner of insane theory flourished around the incident over the ensuing 50 years, but the Soviet government's very sudden closing of the case seems to have made it the most popular culprit in the minds of the theorists. Orange spheres were sighted in the sky on the night the Dyatlov group died, by campers about 50 miles away from the scene. Some explain these away as R-7 intercontinental missile launches, seeing as the last campsite was located on the pathway from Balakoner Cosmodrome to Kyornaya Guba, a Soviet nuclear testing ground. Per the radiation found in the skiers' clothing, some speculated that they drank melted contaminated snow. A 12-year-old eyewitness who attended 5 of the skiers' funerals claimed that the bodies had a deep brown tan. And you can't talk conspiracies and radiation without mentioning aliens and UFOs, of course. Some folks even blame the snowmen referenced in the students' newspaper. To this day, a scientific explanation for the deaths of these 9 people has yet to be nailed down. Manifold publications were inspired by the incident, some investigative journalism and some entirely fiction. The mountain pass where the skiers set up their last campsite was named for Dyatlov, and the Dyatlov Foundation, established by Yuri Kuntsevich, none other than the child eyewitness at the skiers' funerals in 1959, still works to persuade the Russian government to reopen the investigation. The foundation operates the Dyatlov Museum in Ekaterinburg as well, to commemorate the dead travelers and tell the story of their strange ends. 4. The strange case of the Pollock twins. The Pollock twins were English girls, who are often referenced as proof of reincarnation. Their parents, John and Florence Pollock, lived in Hexham, England. They had 2 daughters, Joanna, 11, and Jacqueline, 6. On May 5, 1957, the 2 children were killed in a car accident. The parents were understandably devastated. Florence got pregnant the following year, and gave birth to twin girls on October 4, 1958. Jillian and Jennifer were identical twins, but they had different birthmarks. Jennifer had a birthmark on her waist that matched a birthmark that Jacqueline had. She also had a birthmark on her forehead that resembled a scar that Jacqueline had. The family moved to Whitley Bay when the twins were 3 months old. 2 years later, the girls started asking for toys that had belonged to their elder sisters, despite never having seen the toys before. After the family returned to Hexham, the twins, despite never having been there, pointed out landmarks their older sisters had known. They also began to panic upon seeing moving cars, shrieking, "The car is coming to get us." After they turned 5, their memories of their previous lives faded, and they went on to lead normal lives. The twins eventually attracted the attention of Dr. Ian Stevenson, 1918-2007, a psychologist who studied reincarnation in children. In 1987, he wrote a book called Children Who Remember Previous Lives, A Question of Reincarnation. In it, he described 14 cases of reincarnation, including that of the Pollock girls. Stevenson studied reincarnation for 40 years. During that time, he investigated thousands of cases. A majority took place in Asian countries, where many people believe in reincarnation. He preferred to conduct his research where belief in reincarnation was common, because parents who did not believe in reincarnation often discouraged a child from talking about their past lives. Additionally, children made the best study subjects, as they were less likely to make up stories about past lives. A lot of people, like John Pollock, believe in reincarnation. It is a tenet of some religions like Hinduism and Buddhism. The appeal of reincarnation is obvious: people live more than one life, and they don't suffer eternal punishment after death. Does it really happen, though? Researchers like Dr. Stevenson have been studying reincarnation for over 50 years at the University of Virginia. As previously noted, they typically work with children because they have found adults that claim to be reincarnated might have actually been influenced by books, movies or the like. Dr. Stevenson described a case in which a psychologist subjected a woman to hypnosis. She described a life as a courtier of Richard II, during the 14th century. It turned out that the woman had read a novel set at the court of Richard II several years before, and many of the details from her past life came from the novel. It is less easy to explain away reincarnation cases involving small children in such a fashion. Some cases, while anecdotal, are startling. James Leininger, for example, was born in 1998 in San Francisco. He began having nightmares about plane crashes when he was 2. Those nightmares stemmed from memories of a past life as a World War II pilot. James also could tell his parents all about planes from that era, and his parents weren't World War II buffs, who kept a lot of books or memorabilia around. It does seem strange that such young children could have memories that do not seem to be their own. The Pollock twins are just one of many examples that seem to be cases of reincarnation. However, if reincarnation is real and we can come back after death, this is cause for hope. We can be provided a little comfort in the thought that when our loved ones die, perhaps they will come back to us as someone else. 5. The WOW signal. This summer marks the 40th anniversary of one of the more interesting unsolved mysteries in astronomy. The mystery has its origins in the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, or SETI, effort which, as this name implies, is the attempt to detect extraterrestrial civilizations, if they exist, by means of any emissions they might give out. Primarily, this is taken to be radio, although other regions of the electromagnetic spectrum have also been investigated. The entire SETI effort makes numerous assumptions about the biological and technological evolution of any intelligent race of aliens, as well as about behaviors they might exhibit, and would appear to have, at best, a minimal chance of success. However, given the vast distances between stars, it would still seem to be the most likely means by which any such civilization might be detected. The longest-running SETI effort to date was initiated during the early 1970s by Ohio State University, utilizing a 300-foot wide Big Ear radio telescope located near Delaware, Ohio, and continued until 1998, when the Big Ear telescope was torn down to make way for a housing development and golf course. In the summer of 1977, an astronomer volunteering for the project, Jerry Eman, was examining computer printouts of data taken on August 15 of that year when he noticed an extremely strong signal that had been recorded by the telescope. The signal was so strong, and so unique in its characteristics, that Eman circled the printout's depiction of the signal and wrote "WOW" next to it. This has been known as the WOW signal ever since. What makes the WOW signal so unique is not only its strength, but the fact that its shape on the printout is exactly what one would expect for an artificial signal emitted in deep space, affected by the Earth's rotation. Due to that rotation, any stationary signal in space would have been within view of the radio receiver for 72 seconds, and would have started off weak, reached a maximum in strength halfway through that interval, and then decreased back to a weak level, before leaving the viewing window. This is precisely what the telescope recorded. Furthermore, the signal is very narrow in its frequency range, something that might be expected for a signal of artificial origin. Given all this, it is tempting to conclude that the WOW signal might indeed be the result of a radio transmission by an intelligent civilization. However, the dictum "extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence," popularized a few decades ago by American astronomer Carl Sagan, although similar thoughts appear in the writings of the 18th century Scottish philosopher David Hume, would certainly apply here. Part of this process would be the elimination of other potential, and more likely, explanations. One of the most important parts of the verification process would be reproducibility. Unfortunately, despite over 50 attempts to detect the signal again with the Big Ear telescope, It was never recorded again, and numerous attempts by other radio telescopes, all over the world have also failed to record it. We are thus left with a brief one-time incident, that took place almost 4 decades ago. The signal's resemblance to what one would expect of an artificially made transmission suggests that it may well have been human-made in origin. A satellite in low Earth orbit would have been traveling too fast to have remained in the telescope's viewing window for the full duration, and some kind of reflection from the ground-based transmission would seem to be extremely unlikely given the dynamics involved. However, a transmission from a more distant object would seem to be a reasonable possibility. Thus far, however, no potential culprit has been identified, although it is entirely conceivable that a still classified military spacecraft from the US or the then Soviet Union, or elsewhere, might have been responsible. As for natural explanations, quite a few objects in space, both in our galaxy and beyond, give off radiation in the radio part of the spectrum, including, especially, at the frequency of 1.42 GHz where the signal was recorded, as this is a strong frequency of hydrogen, the most abundant element in the universe. However, these tend to be broad emissions, frequency-wise, which runs counter to the narrow frequency width of the signal. One explanation which has been receiving some publicity lately hinges on the fact that 2 dim comets were near the location of the site of the signal at the time it was recorded. Since comets are partially made up of water, and hydrogen is a product of the dissociation of water, this could, conceivably, fit the bill. However, the comets involved are extremely dim. They weren't even discovered until 3 decades later, and were near the most distant parts of their orbit where they were unlikely to be active, and were well beyond the point at which water becomes active anyway. At the very least, then, there are substantial issues with this potential explanation. The site of the WOW signal is in eastern Sagittarius, somewhat to the east of the handle of the characteristic teapot of that constellation, and is currently best seen in our southern sky in the hours after midnight. 4 decades on, the mystery remains unsolved, and while it would still seem to be very unlikely that this one-time event was due to the activities of an advanced extraterrestrial civilization, for now, at least, the possibility, however slim, remains. 6. Who put Bella in the Wych Elm? In wartime England, 4 teenage boys were hunting for rabbits and bird eggs in Hagley Wood, on the outskirts of Birmingham, when they found what they thought was an animal skull inside a hollow witch hazel tree. There was a bottle in there too, and a pair of ladies' shoes. When they pulled the items out, they discovered that the skull had human teeth and hair, and was probably not an animal's skull after all, whereupon they showed it to one of the boys' older brothers. Then they decided that they weren't really supposed to be on the property in the first place, so they put everything back in the tree trunk, and went on their merry ways without mentioning it to anyone else. Only one of the boys, the youngest, told his parents, who phoned the police. When the skull was again retrieved from the tree, a skeleton was also exhumed, along with a few more personal items, all of which were found to have belonged to a petite, middle-aged woman who'd given birth at least once. She had dark hair, distinctly irregular teeth, and a wad of taffeta stuffed in her throat. She was missing a hand and a sick bone. These were found buried next to the tree. She'd been dead for at least a year and a half. It was 1943 and World War II was in full swing, which meant there was a huge uptick of reports being filed on missing persons in Europe. The police suspected the woman was foreign, possibly German or Dutch, based on the items found with her body, and the fact that no one matching the description had been reported as missing anywhere near Hagley Wood. Dental records were combed exhaustively without a match. But with a war's worth of missing women to choose from, and not a lot to identify this one by, the case soon grew cold. Around 2 years later, near Christmas of 1944, graffiti appeared on an empty building in the West Midlands town of Old Hill that asked, in 3-inch letters, WHO put Bella down the Wych Elm. Witch elms and witch hazels are commonly mistaken for one another. Variations on the theme soon appeared in and around the Midlands, usually including the name Obella or Bella, and the words Hagley Wood. Sometimes it just said Hagley Wood Bella. After a few weeks, the phrases homogenized into a consistent one. WHO put Bella in the Wych, sometimes witch, ELM. All graffiti seemed to be written in the same hand, block letters in white chalk. If the graffiti artist had a lead on the corpse's identity, He or she never contacted the authorities with it. But the lady now had a name, whether it was correct or not, and the locals, including the police, adopted it. Theories about Bella swirled over the years. Some said she was a rape victim, some said she was an ostracized gypsy woman. Some called her a prostitute. The severed hand was said to refer to the Hand of Glory, a black magic ritual that transfers the power of a dead criminal to the living. To complement this idea, it was pointed out that the spirit of a witch supposedly can be imprisoned, if her body is placed in a hollow tree. A spy ring was definitely operating in the Midlands, during the Birmingham Blitz, and a woman named Clarabella Drunkers, who was about 30 and had irregular teeth, was allegedly the wife of a known Dutch spy. A 35-year-old German cabaret actress named Clara Bauerl, which sounds kind of like Bella, was involved with the Nazi espionage scene and had disappeared in 1941 or so, and her teeth were unusual too. Among this was, of course, no evidence that Bella was even the lady's name. It could have just been an affectionate epithet coined by the graffiti's author. The woman in the witch hazel was never concretely identified, nor was the situation surrounding her murder. The tree has also since died. The graffiti, however, outlived everybody. It continued popping up throughout the English Midlands for years and years, particularly recurring in white spray paint on the 200-year-old Wychbury obelisk in Birmingham, reading WHO put Bella in the witchy LM. Like the woman found in the tree, no identity has ever been revealed for the artist. 7. The mystery of the SS Ourang Medan. Maritime history is full of tales of ghost ships and sea serpents. Not all of these are true and accurate accounts, or if they are, then are prone to exaggerations and embellishment. Accounts of these natures are hotly debated, between believers and skeptics. While some of these stories originate from centuries ago, one of the more curious tales is mere decades old. Depending on which report is accurate, a curious radio message was received by numerous ships traveling along the Straits of Malacca, situated around Sumatra and Malaysia in either June 1947, or as late as February 1948. At the time, the origins of this message, and SOS, were not known. The message itself was divided into two parts, separated by Morse code that could not be deciphered. Those that received this message insisted that the transcript went, "All officers, including the captain, are dead. Lying in chart room and bridge. Possibly whole crew dead. I die." Nothing else was transmitted after this chilling conclusion. Two ships, both American, picked up the messages and felt compelled to investigate. With the help of British and Dutch listening posts, the coordinates of the vessel thought to be transmitting, the Dutch freighter SS Ourang Medan, were triangulated, and an American merchant ship, the Silver Star, was sent to the coordinates. Given the content of the distress calls, the captain of the Silver Star wasted no time in navigating to the new heading. Several hours later, the lookout on board the Silver Star spotted the stricken Ourang Medan. Even as the rescue ship pulled alongside, no signs of life could be seen visually. All efforts to contact the crew failed, forcing the captain of the Silver Star to organize a search party. The moment that the search party boarded, it was obvious that the messages were horribly accurate. The decks of the Ourang Medan were littered with the corpses of the Dutch crew. To a man, the victims were found with wide-eyed horror, and faces twisted into sheer terror, arms trying to fight off something. Not even the ship's dog escaped the terror of whatever had taken place. The canine was discovered to be in the midst of snarling at the cause. The captain was found, as one might have expected, on his bridge. The remainder of the bridge officers were found in the wheelhouse and chart room. The radio operator, who presumably sent the distress call, was found at his station. The engineering crew were also found at their stations, with precisely the same expressions on their faces. During the search efforts, the rescue party noticed several things that struck them as odd or strange. The local temperature was in excess of 100 degrees Fahrenheit, but members of the team felt an ominous chill emanating from somewhere. Another oddity was the conditions of the victims. All of them had suffered, but none had any injuries to note of. They were also decaying quicker than they should be. The ship itself didn't appear to have suffered any damage, and when the search party returned to the Silver Star, the decision to tow the Ourang Medan for salvage was quickly taken. It was only when the ships were tethered together that smoke was discovered below decks, specifically the number 4 cargo hold. Within seconds of the tow rope being severed, The Ourang Medan exploded with enough force to lift it out of the water, before sinking to the seabed. The first official mention of the incident was made by the United States Coast Guard in May 1952. In addition to the witness testimony of the state of the crew themselves, the published account added that they were all found with their frozen faces upturned to the sun, staring, as if in fear. The mouths were gaping open and the eyes staring. One of the arguments cited against this ever taking place was the registry of the Ourang Medan. Officially speaking, it appears as though it never actually existed. The Silver Star was a real vessel though, but at the time the Ourang Medan was supposed to have been floundering, the Silver Star was operating under another registration, Santa Juana. The Grace Line Shipping Company had bought rights to the ship and renamed it. Those that believe in the Ourang Medan insist that the ship was registered in Sumatra. At the time, Sumatra was a Dutch colony that formed part of what was known as the Dutch East Indies. In Indonesian, Ourang means man and Medan is the largest city on the island of Sumatra. The registered name Ourang Medan literally means man from Medan. No records have been produced to back up this ascertain. Even Lloyd's shipping registers, and the Dictionary of Disasters at Sea 1824-1962, has found no mention of the Ourang Medan. Professor Theodor Seersdorfer of Essen in Germany has spent much of the last 50 years researching the story of the Ourang Medan. Seersdorfer was the first to mention the names of the American ships that originally went in pursuit of the Ourang Medan, and refers anyone interested in their own research to a German booklet written in 1954. The author of this publication was a man called Otto Mielke, and seemingly knew a lot about the mysterious ship. Not just the route it took, the cargo it carried, but the name of the captain. This booklet, called Das Todenschiffen der Südsee, established the date as June 1947, and is often rumored to have been authenticated by a crewman aboard the Silver Star. It was also this booklet that mentioned the cargo hold, and what might have been stored inside. According to this booklet, the cargo holds contained potassium cyanide and nitroglycerin. If this is actually true, then it could explain why there is no official records anywhere. To have these combustible items on a rough sea is tantamount to negligence of the most severe kind. It could also explain the subsequent explosion shortly after the salvage attempt was made. There are those who speculated that the ship was actually carrying a far more sinister and altogether more dangerous cargo. Biological weapons manufactured by Japanese scientists as the result of insidious experiments that even the Nazi regime would balk at, could well have been smuggled out of Japan. Known as Unit 731, it was designed to be a secret research and development meant to create the most dangerous chemical and biological weapons to help establish Japanese supremacy. Unit 731 was formed sometime in 1932, by a Japanese bacteriologist called Shiro Ishii, who conducted terrible experiments during the Second World War. Is it feasible that Unit 731 was smuggled on a nondescript merchant vessel, with a foreign crew to avoid drawing unwanted attention to what was taking place? If so, what went horribly wrong? Comparisons to the Philadelphia experiment have been made by some ufologists. Wraiths have also been blamed for whatever happened aboard the ill-fated ship. The unnatural deaths of the entire crew have lent some form of credibility to these, and other causes that imagination have conjured up in the last half a century. Even undead pirates, like the crew of the fictional Black Pearl, have been blamed by some. Was the SS Ourang Medan a genuine event or just a mariner's seafaring tale designed to scare, frighten or dissuade? After all, as every sailor is fond of revealing, the one that got away was this big.